Welcome, welcome. Hey everyone, sorry we are a little last minute getting started today. We'll just let everyone join and then get rolling. I'm going to ask you to hang on to your discussion questions for now, because I've got a few activities for today. We also have a viewing, so okay, we're getting there. Ooh, people are filling up. Yeah, we're going to give it just like another few minutes as usual, then I will get rolling. So I just typed it in the chat. Just a reminder, your first reading response is due by the end of today. And thank you to the student who emailed me to let me know that I had set, Moodle actually has like a very specific hour setting that I did not notice. So what I had accidentally done is set it for like, 0000 today, which is last night at midnight, which was a little confusing. So if you went onto Moodle today and got an alert that your assignment was late, sorry for scaring you. It's not late. And I have corrected that for all the further assignments. So just so you know, it's due the end of today. And I'm sorry, Amber. Yeah, I didn't mean to scare you. You're always free to email me if you think there might be an issue, especially technically. If you think it might be a tech issue, there's a pretty good chance you're right. So yeah, it's due the end of today. Remember, you do have a grace period. So if you need more time, don't stress out tonight. You can do it tomorrow. And as long as it's in by the end of tomorrow, I'm fine with that. And that's true moving forward. I'm also going to make sure, your media review, media reflection is due on Monday at the end of the day. So we're going to talk about that at the end of today. And it actually is folded into the activity I want to do with Modern Family that we're going to watch. But I also will talk a little bit more logistics, and I'll make sure there's a Q&A period, which is why we might not do the normal discussion question things. I just want to make sure I'm giving us a nice buffer of time. Okay, so the participant count, oh, it's still coming. It's still coming. Key term definition. Yes, great question. So part of your reading response, you have to pick one key term definition. It can be anything from this week. So it can be something from today, yesterday, or the day before. Same thing with the discussion questions. It's anything from this week. You're welcome. Yeah. And again, the real kind of, for me, the point of the weekly reading responses, it just gives me a sense of how you're doing. And it also gives you a little bit of structure to make sure that you're kind of keeping up day to day. And in a lot of ways, it kind of replaces traditional participation grades, which I think don't work as well in an online setting. Even if this was only a synchronous class, I think online participation is a lot trickier to kind of engage with. So that's why I'm doing the reading response. So keep that in mind, that I'm grading your engagement. I don't expect you to have like a mastery over any of this language because it's an intro level class. All right. That's probably enough of my spiel. So we're gonna get started, and I'm gonna go right in to my little slideshow. I have so many tabs open and I never learn where things are. Oh, no. Oh, Olivia, I meant it to be me. Sorry, I'm trying to correct this so it's. No, not do that. Okay, I promise I'm here. I just don't want to kind of put students on blast. So I'm going to be a voiceover today, and maybe tomorrow I'll learn how to be a floating head. Okay, so today we're talking about gender in media and popular culture. I'm really excited about this week. I'm excited about all the weeks, but this one in particular. The reading today that you read does focus more specifically on television. That's largely because media is very broad, and rather than kind of talking about all media in under 3 hours, I thought it would be helpful to kind of focus on a specific format. But before we get kind of started on the reading, I am going to cover a few more general concepts that come from media studies, critical media studies, specifically around gender. So your key terms today are the male gaze, the Bechdel test, tropes, and the word wholesome. So I'm going to give you a minute just to get that all down. And first thing we're going to talk about is the male gaze. So some of you might have heard of this before, but this is another thing that gets kind of talked about very casually in a lot of like self-referential media. So the male gaze is generally kind of the concept that in most forms of popular culture and mainstream media, the camera assumes that the viewer is male. And really the camera takes the form of male viewership. So we can say that the gaze of the camera is the male gaze. And this manifests in a couple of different ways. Probably the most obvious way is that the depiction of women tends to be highly sexualized. I should probably say, and I meant to say this at the beginning, this lecture is going to include some sexually explicit images and some concepts of kind of negative stereotypes. So just so you're aware that that is coming, and in some cases is already here. Right, so the male gaze. So generally speaking, we do see like a hypersexualization of women. And again, the camera tends to orient a woman in a way that focuses on her body, focuses on her sexually, and often treats her as a literal object. And a way that it does this is often in proximity to other figures, usually men. So some of the images we see here, all of the images do depict women in highly sexualized ways, and they're always in relation to a male figure. So I mean, we could look at this image from The Wolf of Wall Street, in which we have Margot Robbie kind of like having her leg, pushing back on Leonardo DiCaprio, who's kind of crawling towards her. I just noticed they're wearing pink and blue. That's a fun bonus. So the fact that Margot Robbie's sexuality is in proximity to a male body, that the male body is approaching her, that she is, technically preventing her from approaching her, but doing it in a way in which, she has this very feminine sexual object at the high heel. Her leg is exposed. She's wearing an impossibly short skirt. So it is this like very sexualized relationship between male desire and femininity and female sexuality. Below is an image from the film, from the TV series Weeds. Mary Louise Parker, who's the main character of Weeds, is kind of front and center, and she's wearing essentially negligee. She's wearing, what might be considered underwear, or a very short kind of green satin skirt. All the men around her are dressed fully in suits, are assuming kind of like powerful posturing poses. They're all kind of huddled around a car, and they're kind of staring past her. So the focus is really on Mary Louise Parker, and we see her contrasted to a lot of male figures. And again, the assumption here is that a male viewer is going to, a straight male viewer, I should say, is going to be enticed by the sexualized female body and going to self-identify with the men around her. So male gaze also applies to the way men are represented in media. not going to do every image, but the last one I'm going to do, and this I think really speaks to the way men get depicted in media in terms of male gaze, is the movie Sin City. I used to teach this film when I looked at the male gaze, and I opted to teach Modern Family this time, mostly because I found this article that you read that I really liked the way it talked about the history of gender. But one thing that I like about, well, I don't like about Sin City, but that I think Sin City is a great teachable film is the way men and women are portrayed. So Sin City is based on a graphic novel, and the cinematography is this like kind of really cool stylized thing. And the women in Sin City are extremely hypersexualized. The majority of them are kind of like vigilante sex workers, strippers, the girlfriends of main characters. But we just see in this image alone, I mean, we see Jessica Alba front and center. Jessica Alba does play an exotic dancer. To her left, actually her right, but our left, Brittany Murphy is wearing, the late Brittany Murphy is wearing just kind of a bra, and is like, her clothes are falling off. And then we have Rosario Dawson on the right, licking her lips sexually. You can see she's wearing a dominatrix collar. Her red lips are one of the only colored images on the people. The men in this poster, and certainly the men in this movie, are a real contrast, because most of the men in this movie are not only not sexualized, but not particularly aesthetically pleasing. The men tend to be really gruff and aggressive, very rough, much, much older. And there's an idea that masculinity is not necessarily supposed to not only be beautiful, but not even supposed to be aestheticized. Aesthetics refers to kind of like the value and beauty of a visual object. So that masculinity, in contrast to femininity, masculinity is rough and can even be kind of ugly, and it's still powerful and it's still sexy, where a woman's power actually comes from a hypersexuality and comes from her desirability to men. So that's the male gaze in kind of a quick one. This is a great example. This is a meme that was going around maybe a few years ago, and it talks about the way that posters depict male versus female superheroes. So this is a great example because Avengers is a co-ed team, but we see here that Scarlett Johansson's Black Widow, and this is very typical of a lot of female characters in the kind of superhero franchise. All the other characters who are men are in these powerful poses. They're like very muscular, and their bodies are kind of forward facing in a way that shows up their faces and the kind of the broadness of their shoulders. And for no particular reason, Scarlett Johansson is facing away from the camera. She is like technically punching, which is like strong, but again, for no reason, we're featuring like the back of her body. We're featuring her backside. She's kind of like peeking over her shoulder. So this other image on the right kind of shows the absurdity of that, and what it would look like if we posed male superheroes the way we pose female superheroes. I don't want to suggest that this is a kind of female gaze, because I don't think this image on the right is what like quote unquote women want to see. This is more about just kind of drawing our attention to kind of how silly and intentional it is that we sexualize women in this way, especially when it's characters who are essentially part of a team in the same movie. We assume that male superheroes and female superheroes have kind of a one-to-one ratio in terms of their representation and strength, but the way they're depicted is quite different. Another kind of side point, I was talking to a friend of mine who writes about feminist pop culture, and we were talking about the way female bodies as superheroes are portrayed, and that when men kind of in comic book franchises have super strength, they're usually like quite large and muscular, and their strength is kind of visually represented, whereas when women have super heroic strength, it's usually mystical in some way. So strong women who are very, very strong in superhero movies tend to have bodies, we may say like gymnasts, dancers, or swimmers. We don't see a lot of like large muscular women, whereas so if we think of like Captain America or Rogue, or even like kind of Black Widow, these characters who if they do have physical strength, it comes from kind of some kind of like mystic force, whereas super strong men like Thor and the Hulk, Superman, have these like hulking muscles that are the source of their strength. So that has a lot to do with the sexualization of both genders. You might be asking yourself, is there such thing as a female gaze? I mean, this is something that's been largely like theorized, and we actually get a lot of this from photography and visual arts. It also does start to kind of pop up in media, and this is something that's questioned, the way that female gaze would operate. So, I mean, obviously a part of it is the hypersexualization or lack thereof of women. These are some image taken. The bottom left in particular, I want to draw your attention to is from the first instance, the first Wonder Woman film. And the film received a lot of praise actually for the way that the Amazon population was depicted, and it was kind of said that it really wasn't this male fantasy. And then when the movie was recast and shot by a different director, the sequel, or I think it was like one of like the collaborative expanded universe movies that had the Amazons in it. Most of the Amazons were kind of recast as models. But we see in this that, like, you know, the women, there's actually quite a bit of age discrepancy or variation in the casting. So it's not just kind of like young athletic models. The women's athleticism is often quite like physically strong. Their uniforms are not highly sexualized. It tends to look actually more like armor. And they're depicted as being strong in a larger variety of ways. I think with all the images, it's important to note that there are no men in these images. So the female form, female beauty is not kind of being interpreted in relation to the way it's looked at as a man. And then, of course, there's also simply more variety in the way femininity is aestheticized. So we see like maternal femininity, engaging with femininity and aging, particularly like queer Black femininity, and the idea of like looking at different ways of expressing sexuality beyond heterosexuality. Another image that I think is fascinating, this is a couple of images. A friend of mine at the University of Toronto who teaches queer media and pop culture showed me this image and talked about this image of Chris Evans as an example of the female gaze, specifically for straight female women, which I thought was really interesting because obviously there are fairly erotic images of men that are quite popular, and we see like covers of like GQ and like Men's Health. Again, even the superhero franchise, Chris Hemsworth is incredibly sexualized. All the Chris's are pretty sexualized. But my colleague pointed out that this image is particular in the way that although like Chris Evans does have a very like muscular cis body, the way he's positioned actually brings in a lot of signifiers that are not typically feminine. So he is like, especially on the right, the fact that he's kneeling and his clothes are kind of undone, his pants are like coming off, but he's not naked. He's in a state of kind of like half undress that tends to be more depicted towards women, which kind of implies like the active process of undressing, which is very often in a sexual context, more of a feminized thing. On the image on the left, the lighting is really important. The fact that we have a pink and yellow, a pink and blue color palette. It's often coded as like bisexual or queer lighting. There's an article written about an episode of Black Mirror, San Juniper, that talks about the lighting as being particularly queer. And this uses a similar palette, which does, I think, actually kind of trouble the idea that male masculinity, when it's aestheticized, always has to be really rough. Has to be kind of dirty, has to be aggressive, because this definitely, I wouldn't say that this necessarily feminizes Evans, but it is a lot more kind of aesthetically inclined in terms of making him look beautiful, as opposed to like just rugged. And the fact that rugged is such a gendered compliment, like if you said a man was like rugged, that's obviously a huge compliment. Whereas if you said a woman was rugged, that would, culturally speaking, not be as instantly coded as a compliment. And even calling a man beautiful has a complicated context. The other thing I want to bring our attention to, and this again is something I hope you've heard of, is the Bechdel test. So the Bechdel test is something of a benchmark for gauging a minimum amount of feminist engagement in a film. So the place the Bechdel test comes from, it actually comes from a comic book called Dykes to Watch Out For, which Alison Bechdel wrote between the mid-1980s to, I believe, 2005. It was very long running. And so this is a comic strip that kind of, it doesn't actually name it the Bechdel test, that came later, it just calls it the rules, but we see two women coming out of a movie, and one says, you know, want to go see a movie and get popcorn. And the other woman says, I don't know, I have these rules. I only go to movies if it satisfies three basic requirements. One, it has to have at least one woman in it, who two, talk to each other, and three, about something besides a man. And I've actually cut off the end of this, I apologize. The final clip is the woman who had the rules saying, the only movie I've seen in the last 10 years is Alien. because the alien in the movie Alien is actually female. So technically Sigourney Weaver and the alien passed the Bechdel test. So I mean, this has become pretty famous, and I think it's taken out of context a lot of the time. So again, the rules for the Bechdel test is you have to have 2 women in the movie, which feels like a pretty low bar, and is, and yet you would be surprised how often it doesn't pass just for that. The 2 women have to talk to each other. Again, so it usually means they have some kind of relationship. And then the big one is they have to talk to each other about something other than a man. And it's truly alarming how many times a film will fail on this account, where if you have 2 women, the only thing they talk about is either the men in their life or like, you know, the concept of men generally. So we can think about like an episode of Sex and the City failing this left, right, and center, because even though it is a female-driven cast, many of the scenes are female only. Predominantly, that narrative is about everyone's desire to land a husband, or kind of complaining about exes. It's a movie from the late 30s or early 40s called The Women, and it was quite famous at the time because it is an all-female cast. No men appear anywhere on the screen. However, the whole movie is about one woman getting a divorce from her husband because another woman is cheating on her, and then they all go to Nevada because it's the only place you can get a divorce. So the movie, despite being an all-female cast and having about well over a dozen cast members, I don't know that it fully passed the Bechdel test, just because it is still centered on women's identity being based on men. The thing about the Bechdel test is, I mean, I've heard people say like, oh, this movie passed the Bechdel test, so feminism. The point of the Bechdel test is not actually to say that like any movie that passes this test is okay. It's actually, I mean, consider that its source is a comic, and a satiric comic at that. The point is to point out that this is a really low bar for female representation, and still many movies don't pass this. So if a movie passes the Bechdel test, we don't necessarily upgrade it to like a feminist opus. This is more about kind of just looking at the total results of failures of the Bechdel test, and taking that as a sample section of the way representation of women is even when we're asking for the absolute minimum, it still falls quite short. Fun fact, the musical Fun Home is based on an autobiography about Alison Bechdel. So a little right there. Okay, so now we're gonna kind of like pivot into the reading, which means I'm gonna get my notes out. One thing that, again, one reason I did want to talk about television specifically is the relationship to kind of the golden age of television and the way it intersects with gender roles. So the 1950s represent a time of incredible, like rigid gender conformity, and also a time in which kind of like the domestic sphere becomes really important. The idea that a woman's place is in the home, which is not like invented in the 50s, but in terms of it being really solidified and kind of enforced in a very prescriptive way, it's a major turning point. Part of the reason for this is the decades that, I think I mentioned this on the first day, but I'll go into more detail now. The decades that lead up to the 50s actually create quite a bit of destabilization around really strict gender norms. So for example, the 1920s, which are kind of known as the Roaring 20s. So things like flappers become a really big fashion and pop cultural symbol, and flappers, you know, are very sexually, I'm not going to say empowered, but kind of sexually provocative looks for women. They also tend to sport short hair. There's an association between kind of like nightclubs and drinking and jazz culture. So a lot of the 1920s are kind of about a kind of proto-rebellious time in history. With the late 1930s and the early 40s, depending on where in the world you're looking, with the start of World War II, women are called on to join the workforce in a way they never have been before. Prior to this, women in the workforce usually are represented by women who are living in extreme poverty, coming from communities of extreme poverty. But in the 1940s in the US, for example, we get women joining the workforce and going into work into factories. It's a very cute little film from the 90s that was a big part of my childhood called A League of Their Own, which is about the start of the Professional Women's Baseball League. And it is a direct result of the fact that when World War II is kind of at its height in the US, Major League Baseball has to shut down. So the owners of the teams actually start recruiting women to play baseball. So we get this moment of gender inversion. We have women kind of like at home during the war, taking on roles that really question and do a lot to destabilize a very strict understanding of what a woman's role is, of what women's work can and should be. Because we get a few years of proof that women can do anything that men can do and can hold jobs. And are perfectly capable of doing so. And it actually, not only can they do so, but they're doing so out of a sense of, it's not just, a lot of times we talk about gender roles, not we, but people will talk about the gender roles are important to the fabric of society. But in the 1940s, women transgressing gender roles and taking on literally the labor of men saves the society, helps North American culture to continue. So there's actually a lot of anxiety amongst government officials and people in power after World War II that that's going to be permanent. And there's a lot of effort that go into making sure that that we need to go back to zero. And in fact, we need to get more rigid and more strict. So the late 40s and 1950s represents a time in which gender roles become really enforced in an attempt to stamp down all the kind of things we've seen in the last 2 decades. And there's this kind of idea, it's like, thank you for your service. That was just kind of an emergency measure. Now that everything's back to normal, we need to get everything back to normal with a capital N. And just coincidentally, this is also the time where television really kind of like hits its heyday. TV is around in the 30s and 40s. It takes a while to get started, obviously, and there are some interesting questions about what genre is going to really take off. The reading talks about this, that there are a couple of moderately successful sitcoms in the 1940s that are adaptations of radio comedies, like radio plays and radio dramas and radio comedies were a big part of entertainment before television. And that gradually leads to kind of the refining and retooling of the genre. And in the 1950s, we get this explosion of very popular TV shows. And because this coincides with a moment of gender being a really kind of anxiety-fueled issue for people in power, TV becomes a tool of enforcing gender norms. And it does this when we talk about the ton of television production code that lasts from, I believe it's the 50s to the early 80s. It might actually be the 40s to the 80s. I will check on that, but should be in your notes too. But television becomes something of an instructive tool. One of the reasons TV is used and is kind of seen as having a moral imperative in a way, arguably, that's even more important than film. Remember, film has been around for a little bit longer than TV. We get silent films pretty close to the turn of the 20th century. And then we get kind of talkies in the late 20s. A big part of TV's appeal and part of what defines it as a medium that is distinct from film and theater is the fact that it is broadcast directly into your home. One of the things that TV is kind of struggling with in the 30s and 40s is what its identity is, how it is different from film, how it's different from theater. And a big part of that initially is just the fact that TV can broadcast things live. So a lot of early TV is game shows or sporting events. And I mean, that remains huge. Like Sunday Night Football is still like one of the highest rated television programs in the world, or at least in North America. But in the 1950s, what TV kind of gets a sense of as itself as its own medium is the fact that it's coming into your own home. And what's really interesting about the popularity of sitcoms is sitcoms kind of mirror that back. So, I mean, this is an image of just some popular TV shows from the last 60 years. And one thing I want you to kind of notice is the setting of all of these. It was surprisingly not very hard to find an image that worked in this pattern. And the role of the living room couch as a central symbol of a TV family. The majority of sitcoms still are organized around the domestic sphere. And the domestic sphere becomes, especially in the 1950s, a symbol of family and a symbol of the sphere of a woman and a woman's responsibility in kind of creating the cohesion of a family. So one of the reasons that TV gets this imperative of needing to be not just inoffensive, but actually instructional, that it's going to teach people how to behave properly, is that it's in your house. And that's very intimate. It's very different from going out to see it in the theater, because with a film, you can kind of take it or leave it, and you can make decisions about what you want to go and do. And it's more of a social event. Television is less of a social event and more a domestic event. It lives in your house with your children, and it's very marketed as something that's going to be helpful in raising your children and helping you know how you're supposed to behave and act. So that's a really big part of the way television kind of insinuates itself within the home. The fact that it's literally in the home is a big part of it. So yeah, the television code, yep, 51 to 83, I know I found it, does stipulate that programs should enlarge the horizons of viewers. I think that language is fascinating because what does that mean? It means nothing. Provide him with wholesome entertainment, afford helpful stimulation, and remind him of his responsibilities with the citizens he has, which the citizen has towards society. So, I mean, I do want to clock the male pronouns in this, which is, I think, more a case of the way language in a lot of copy, press, and literature existed until pretty recently. The idea that a hypothetical subject is always he and always him, because that is the person who messages are intended for. Again, we see this as a kind of male gaze from a literary perspective, and that men are going to be the leaders of any kind of social change, and women and children will fall in line because their job is to follow. I mean, the word wholesome is interesting because of, again, it's quite vague. Like good wholesome television is something we still hear. It's definitely something I heard it kind of described to things like Full House. And I mean, technically the word wholesome actually is refers to food. When food is like, it basically means it's good for you and it's healthy. When that is applied to morality, the issue is that wholesomeness is extremely subjective. Not objective, subjective, because it really depends on what your values are. So certainly in the 1950s, wholesome meant that it reinforced strict gender roles, that it reinforced the nuclear family. So you did not ever have a single parent family. You did not ever have divorce. You always depicted the family unit as strong and cohesive. You always depicted the mother as a homemaker who was faithful and obedient to a husband. During the television code, fathers too absolutely are seen as kind of infallible patriarchs. There's that word again. They are role models. They're tough but fair and emotionally distant in a good way. And you didn't show anything that was controversial. So you didn't show anything that had any association with controversial topics. So you absolutely did not show any political issues. You did not show people of color. You did not show any like homosexuals. Characters of color do start to emerge in mainstream television in the 1970s, but for the majority of the television code, and a lot of that is the result of civil rights and the kind of critiquing of what is considered morally wholesome. But that is, excuse me, that is a big part of it. So, you know, keep in mind the degree to which TV has a history of being instructional and being instructional in a very gendered way. And the way that the home and the domestic sphere is a gendered space, particularly in the mid-20th century. Yeah, and here's an image on wholesome values. I probably should have shown this while I was talking. But here are some images of families being wholesome. Again, we show all of the images. Well, the images all imply at least that we are in a kitchen, and they do show women in some kind of domestic servitude sphere. So 1, 2, 3 of the women are serving. 4, if we count June Cleaver on the right, who's putting on an apron, kind of shaking her head, lovingly looking down at her husband. And I mean, a lot of these characters do become templates. So the fact that June Cleaver always wears pearls becomes kind of a symbol of femininity in maternity. So The Simpsons aesthetic depiction of Marge and Lisa always wearing pearls is a direct reference to this. Yeah. So in the beginning of television and throughout, we start to get essentially two really enduring stereotypes of mothers and women. It's almost not necessary to say and, because the majority of television, women have to be mothers or children because they take place in the home, and who else would you be? So we get pretty quickly the idea of the quote unquote daffy female character. This is a term from the reading. I don't know that I would use the word daffy, but like, why don't we just go with it because it's already there. So the daffy female character often becomes the source of conflict for the drama. I'll use the top left, I Love Lucy, because it's probably the earliest trope I know pretty well. I Love Lucy is also really accessible on YouTube. If you're not familiar with it, check her out. Most of the episodes of I Love Lucy, so Lucy is married to Ricky Ricardo, who is a Latin singer and percussionist. He plays the bongos, it comes up a lot. And Lucy is a housewife who always wants to either get a job or join the band, and she is not allowed to. That's ridiculous. So most of the drama from the show is Lucy either sneaking out to get a job and it going comically wrong, or like wearing some kind of kooky disguise or hiding inside a bongo drum to try and join the band. And it always ends with, you know, Ricky kind of chastising Lucy and Lucy like whining. That's a pretty characteristic Lucy moment, is the like, but Ricky. The image up here is actually, it's a pretty famous scene where Lucy and her gal pal Ethel, who's her neighbor, who's also a housewife, of course, get a job at a chocolate factory, and their job is to just kind of put chocolate into boxes, but the contraption starts to go too fast, they can't keep up, and they just kind of, there's this scene, it's very slapstick, where they're just shoving chocolate in their mouths and in their bras and in their clothes because they can't do it fast enough, and it's wacky. And of course they get fired in the first 5 minutes because they can't have jobs. They need to go home and be women. So, I mean, this is a type that emerges and is more popular, I would say, in early television. It actually starts to dissipate for some interesting reasons. But one thing that happens in the 60s is the wacky, I'm going to use wacky, I like wacky. The wacky wife type is kind of actually starts to stand in for feminism in the 60s, because we get characters in shows like Bewitched and I Dream of Jeannie, in which we have women who are not quite as wacky, they're still a little wacky, but we get characters who have actual like magic powers. So we have these powerful women who can do things and are technically more powerful than their husbands, but that power is at odds with their domestic roles. So for example, most of the plots of Bewitched are Samantha, who's a witch, who's married a mortal, just trying to be normal. And usually accidentally magic is involved, and it threatens the normalcy of their kind of life. And the husband chastises her, and she's like, "Oh, Darren, I'm so sorry. I'm just trying to be normal sauce." WandaVision parodied this in some really fun ways, I thought. I thought they could have done more with the feminist angle, but we can talk about that later. So, I mean, that is something that happens really interestingly in the 60s, is that television does start to essentially depict in a very coded way. And coding is when we show something in kind of a metaphoric way that an audience hopefully understands, but not too aggressively. These are examples of coded feminism, where feminism is parodied, turned into something funny, and shown as something that women should want to get rid of for the sake of their stability. Again, Sam and Jeannie are both very powerful women. But they have a decision to make. It's like, do they want to be powerful or do they want to be happy? And of course, happy means married with children in a house. And the lesson of both of these shows is, you know, being powerful is great, but it's going to be really lonely. And you're not going to have all of the great things the patriarch can give you, like a husband who will buy you a house and you can cook in it. So that becomes kind of a message. And that's an interesting way that the trope of the daffy wife is kind of adapted. Daffy wife does tend to dissipate a little in the post television code era, and we'll talk about that. Not completely, but I think it becomes a lot more subtle, unlike another trope which kind of explodes. So another trope which I'm always fascinated by is the mother as a warden, and the husband is kind of a man-child. So this exists, again, this exists from the beginning. So if we see a show like The Honeymooners, again, a lot of the plots involve the men trying to get away with things. So men sneaking out to go bowling when they're supposed to be, you know, not bowling. Men like sneaking out to go fishing when they're supposed to be visiting their mother-in-law. These early on, the Flintstones also does a lot of this because the Flintstones is basically just the Honeymooners, but animated and set in prehistoric times. So the Honeymooners and the Flintstones, and basically this early Warden character usually tends to pop up in either childless couples or couples in which the child is very, very young. So we get this mother as kind of a nag who is always blocking the husband's desire to have fun, to go on adventures, to behave like essentially a child himself, or like an adolescent, we might say. This becomes, now the reason that this is not necessarily a super popular dynamic in the 50s and even the early 60s, certainly the 40s, is that very often the way television writers interpret the code is that the male figure, the man, has to stand in for a patriarch. And so very often the thing with this dynamic is that it's hard to create a man who's a really good role model, who's going to teach men how to behave and then to teach children to listen to their fathers, if you're depicting the father as kind of childish. So we don't get a ton of this figure in very, very early television. But as time goes on, this starts to become more and more popular, particularly with the erosion of the television code. Once TV shows are less shackled to needing to be really aggressively constrictive, and arguably also once patriarchy is more generally under criticism, we start to get this trope way, way more with women who basically are there to kind of nag and control their man-child husbands. And in a lot of ways, this is an outgrowth of the concept of the feminist killjoy we talked about yesterday. The idea, even if these characters don't necessarily self-identify as feminists, the idea that a woman in control is the death of joy, that female power is there to restrict, to be a wet blanket, to nag, and he's basically there to stop men from having fun. Usually the character, so like Homer Simpson is like, I think maybe the best example of this dynamic, where Marge's catchphrase is just kind of, Lois Griffin. I don't know if people, not Lois Griffin, well, actually Lois Griffin perfectly, but Lois in Malcolm in the Middle. I don't know if this is a cultural reference that has been super well remembered, but Lois is kind of portrayed as this just like constantly screaming, very much the warden of these like this unruly family of all men. And this, I think, becomes, like very, very popular. We're going to talk about this a little today as we go on. So those are the two big tropes that I want to talk about. Another moment, and this is, I found this was fascinating, is the way that women's liberation impacted television, and specifically the creation of the workplace comedy. Okay, this blew my mind. So workplace comedies, as we know, are comedies centered around the workplace. And they typically are very, I mean, they're sitcoms, but the variation on a traditional sitcom is that unlike, sitcoms of that really dominated the 40s and the 50s, which are always set in the home, workplace sitcoms are set in in a workplace. So we could think of a TV show like Parks and Recreation. The Office is 100% like the workplace comedy, but they're really, really common. The Mindy Project, I don't know if people know what Ally McBeal is, 30 Rock, Ugly Betty. The thing about workplace comedies is that prior to the explosion of women's liberation, there were no workplace comedies on TV. There were action kind of based cop dramas in which men would usually be having some kind of adventure, and that would usually focus around a job. But in terms of a TV show that looked like a sitcom, but it was people in an office just having relationships, that did not exist before That Girl and Mary Tyler Moore. And Mary Tyler Moore really is the blueprint for this. And so what's interesting, if we look at the history of women's liberation in workplace comedies, is that the earliest workplace comedies actually are pop culture's attempt to deal with this image of women joining the workforce. And so that actually does continue for quite some time. So a lot of workplace comedies do tend to have something of a feminist bent. So in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a show called Murphy Brown, which is about a broadcast journalist named Murphy Brown. She is pretty outspoken about her feminism. A lot of the show was about her dealing with being a strong, aggressive, outspoken woman, like a tough journalist in a male-dominated field. The actress who played her, Candice Bergen, got pregnant in the run of the show, and they wrote it in so that Murphy became a single mom. And there was a huge backlash. And what was kind of brilliant at the time is that George Bush, who was in office, George Bush the first, not the W, he would talk about and kind of defame and outcry that Murphy Brown was a really bad example and was terrible in television, and he would always use the character's name. So the show actually would use clips from actual George Bush condemning Murphy Brown and make it look like it was happening in the universe. It was kind of brilliant. Maybe we should watch that next year. So yeah, so and I mean, like, and we get like Ally McBeal, we kind of get Lee Betty. Parks and Rec arguably does this, I think, pretty well, where it is still about ambitious women trying to survive in male-dominated fields like medicine, government, television, the law. Ally McBeal, what's up? Now, after some time, obviously, we do start to get workplace comedies that are not necessarily focused on women. So like The Office is not necessarily a deliberate like workplace comedy. Brooklyn Nine-Nine is not like a feminist workplace comedy. But this genre really wouldn't exist without the advent of women in the workplace and women's liberation. And there's a pretty strong legacy of working women and single working women kind of inventing this genre. Part of the reason behind that really is before women entered the workplace, what would this look like? Which brings me to my next point is how masculinity is portrayed on TV. The thing about an all-male workplace is that office-based sitcoms revolve around relationships. Masculinity does not thrive on the expressions of feelings and the growth of relationships. So in a lot of male-focused TV, there's actually not a ton of male-focused TV that I think is super popular, although like, now that I say that, I'm not sure I believe that. Historically speaking, male-based entertainment and television tends to be action-based. So early, we get a lot of Westerns. Those don't last super long. We also start to get a lot of like cop dramas, or just kind of like other variations on action. So MacGyver is a great example, who's this kind of like, I think he's like a detective who solves crimes with paper clips or something. But we see that like when television or really entertainment is male driven, it can't really sustain on the development of relationships because there is an anxiety around men having relationships with each other. When men have relationships, it's with women, and you cannot do that in an all-male cast, which I think is worth noting and also worth kind of clocking. Now, this is something that I think in the last decade or so starts to destabilize. I think you could make a really interesting analysis. If anyone wants to write about Entourage for their media analysis, that would be fascinating, because that I think is a show that, I mean, I don't think it's super successful in doing this, but it does attempt to look at male relationships and masculinity. I will say I've not watched a ton of Entourage. I can't really stand it, but probably worth studying. Anyway, yeah, so when it comes to men and masculinity on TV, there actually is quite a bit of limitation because of the like homophobic anxiety, frankly, around men building relationships. The flip side of that is there actually are quite a few shows about women building relationships on TV. And this actually does also kind of grow out of workplace comedy, but becomes its own kind of subgenre. It's not quite as prevalent maybe as it used to be. Again, I think Laverne and Shirley is maybe the earliest outgrowth of this. Laverne and Shirley, technically two women who work together, but it is more about their relationship. There's often quite a few cases of this being about single women living together. So The Golden Girls is a great example of this, which is four senior women who are in their late 50s to 80s, who all live together, and it is about them kind of navigating the politics of being like approaching elderly age and being women and being single. There's also the show Living Single, which starred like a young Queen Latifah in the 90s, which is about four women all like living together. It has some resonance with Sex and the City. It's a little less obnoxiously focused on finding a man and drinking martinis. Absolutely Fabulous, which is a British sitcom from the 90s and 2000s, which is something of a gay icon, is kind of about these like two self-destructive kind of hot messes named Eddie and Patsy, but it is essentially about their relationships. More recently, we might think of something like Broad City or Girls, if you can stand it. which does kind of speak to female relationships a bit. So I spent this little intro talking a lot about the role of women in television, and you might kind of walk away thinking like, wow, women are everywhere. This is amazing. Like, well, it depends where you look. There are really great examples of women in television. If we look at the most successful television, if we look at the highest rated television, we still see an overwhelming representation of male media. Most of the most highly rated television shows of the last 50 years have a stronger ratio of men to women. Things like MASH, Cheers, ER, Mad Men, The Sopranos, Breaking Bad, Seinfeld are all shows that have more men than women. Men have larger roles, men tend to get more screen time, get more complicated roles. The women in their lives are very often, they're not always kind of relational. So, I mean, a show like The Big Bang Theory, most of the women exist in proximity to the main characters. Penny is kind of there to be a contrast to the masculinity, whereas the male figures exist in relationship to themselves. They're not there to kind of contrast the women. So just something to think about in terms of that there is still, as much as today we're looking at optics and tropes, and so I have focused more about male and female gender in that sense. If we're looking at representation from kind of a visibility coverage perspective, there is actually a large amount of discrepancy there. So we're going to talk about Modern Family in a second, but I want to check in. Why doesn't everyone just take a minute and let's do like a quick check-in in terms of if you have any questions. If you have a question from the lecture, I would love to hear it. If you want to offer a question about that you brought for your reading responses, that's great too. So just take a minute, jot it down, and then you can put it in the chat, or we can share it out loud. So go. Mine's actually interesting. Yeah. Okay, so just finish with so just wrap up anything you're writing. If you want to share it in the text, I will read it. I already see a few. If you want to raise your hand and share it out loud, that's great too. Oh, yeah. So right off the, Karen shared that the idea of enlightened sexism is interesting. The idea that women have made so much progress that now we can bring back sexist stereotypes. That's really interesting. And I think that would be such a cool project to track the kind of peaks and valleys of sexist stereotypes in television. Oh, someone has asked me, I did not do this, but I would love to. This is a great idea, is to look at remakes. So shows like Dynasty and the Goldbergs and just see What's been different about the remakes? That would be cool. We could do that. I haven't done it. I think I watched one episode of Dynasty and was like, absolutely not. But I did notice there was a queer character, and I was like, okay. Oh, so there's a great question about children's television and entertainment, male characters versus female characters. So I mean, there is still, and problematic though she be, a lot of there was a lot of kind of research done around the success of something like Harry Potter, but more generally the idea that in children's entertainment, much like adult entertainment, there's the assumption that young girls will watch a TV show about a male protagonist, but boys will not watch a TV show with a female protagonist. And a lot of it does have to do with a sexist lesson that when little boys are taught that to do anything like a girl is to do it badly and to be weak, whereas girls do not necessarily to the same degree receive the same message about masculinity and are kind of told implicitly that, you know, masculinity is kind of the norm, is the default setting. Disney movies are always really interesting because there is a high level of like princess-centric Disney, but those characters invariably are like, you know, doing everything they can to land a man and sell their voices. So that's always really interesting around the marketing of that. I mean, I don't know a ton about like contemporary children's entertainment beyond the Disney franchise because I have Disney Plus now. And it is interesting that at least the pattern around gender in Disney continues. And there is this kind of desire, like Frozen is maybe the best example, and like to a lesser extent Brave. But this idea that it's like, okay, well, we have to make them princesses. That's non-negotiable. But maybe if we can just figure out a way to make the princesses less problematic, but there is like a refusal to abandon the princess model. I think that's interesting. Okay, someone asked me a question about, is it that they've heard that women are actually paid less, like women who model and do kind of like stills are paid less if they don't show their faces. And so like will often be shot as like just kind of like a torso or a leg. And so often producers will use that both to pay women less, but also it is a way of sexualizing and very much like objectifying, dehumanizing the female body. I don't know about the pay thing. It would make a lot of sense only because I know in acting, even like, so extras, an extra with a line, an extra who says like, hey, gets paid more than an extra who just stands there. So I think it would make a lot of sense that not showing your face would influence your pay scale. Certainly in the male gaze. This is one thing I didn't show in the male gaze slide, but it's very true that very often a lot of movie posters show kind of like disembodied women. So you often see, especially kind of like a guy's comedy, it's very often to see kind of two men standing beside a female body or part of a female body, or a female body who's kind of like in a weird proportion to the men, because it emphasizes a woman as like as kind of an object. Um, Someone asks us why anger is so often scoffed at as women is ridiculous, and the angry feminist trope. Why women don't have the right to be angry. I mean, I think, oh, that's a great question, as to why female anger is either depicted as totally unreasonable or as like a comic trope. And I think a lot of it has to do with a pretty intentional desire to stop women from criticizing sexist systems. And it's kind of a brilliant move in the heart of patriarchy. If you make it ridiculous or unattractive or unreasonable to critique something, you're kind of impervious to criticism, and it forces women to simply accept. Another way to say this is gaslighting. It's this like very cross-cultural, long-standing form of gaslighting, where if you complain about the thing keeping you down, you're invalidated. It also makes women generally more subservient. It means that they will try and compete less with men naturally if they internalize that form of sexism. Well, that's one. Someone else has pointed out that the book The Outsiders, which is written by a woman, but her first name was not included on the cover because the perception of female authors at the time. I've heard that too. So J.K. Rowling never used the initials JK before she put out Harry Potter, and actually she added the K. Her middle initial is not K. I think she has a middle initial, but it was basically she changed her name, or like altered her name slightly to J.K. Rowling so that it would sell more, so that it didn't look like it had a female author, because yes, their perception. That's very common amongst female authors to like initialize their first two letters or to change their name to something a little more androgynous. Yes, and Jane Fonda did talk about the fact that like at a very young age, girls are treated, are trained in certain behaviors and are trained to look for rewards of certain behaviors. Okay. So Mulan is good. I agree. We're going to pivot to our viewing. So go ahead and bring up Netflix if you have it. Hope you do. Wait, where'd it go? Okay, I'm gonna do that thing. Screen share. Do the thing. Screen share, screen share, screen share. I'm so good at this for the last week, I promise. Okay, we're gonna look at Modern Family today. Again, I have picked Modern Family because I think it does show a lot of stereotypical behavior. It draws on a lot of tropes. So a warning that there are images, themes, content that you might find problematic or offensive. And I want us to engage with that. And I'm kind of aware we're going into this. So take it with a grain of salt. Yeah, as always, viewing is optional. We're watching The Kiss, which is season 2 of episode 2. Some things I'd like you to keep in mind that I'm going to ask you to kind of talk about in groups when we come back. And I'll leave this up. Well, no, I'll close it, but just write it down. Discussion questions. So what gender tropes are represented in Modern Family? Considered tropes covered in the brand reading, or also anything from my lecture. What are the range of roles available to women on the show? So there are quite a few female characters on the show. What is the range? How is masculinity portrayed? And I would add to that, how is the patriarchy portrayed? Is someone the patriarchy? Yes. And lastly, how does ethnicity or race intersect with gender on the show and gender performance? Okay. So I'm going to get you to go watch Modern Family, season 2, episode 2, The Kiss. We are at, it is 2:02. The episode's about 22 minutes, but let's make it a nice round 30 minutes so you have a chance to take a little break in there. So we are going to come back here at 2:32. I will set a timer. I am going to close this window just so that those of you who are watching asynchronously don't get a 30-minute silence. It also means that this is easier to download the image for me. And we will see you back here in 30 minutes. Okay,